Hello and welcome to Commodity Culture, where we break down the commodity space for both new and experienced investors. Before we get started today, standard disclaimer, nothing here is investing advice. Do your own due diligence. And today's guest is the creator and host of the Arcadia Economics YouTube channel, where he guides viewers through the daily financial and economic news with a focus on the silver market. Mr. Chris Marcus, welcome to the show.
Jesse, thanks for having me. Appreciate everything that you're doing, covering on your show, especially in a rather complex financial environment we find ourselves in these days. So appreciate you having me on here and looking forward to talking about everything that's going on.
Well, thank you very much. And I've been following your work for a while now. You're one of the pioneers who paved the way on YouTube. So very happy to stand on the shoulder of giants, as they say. And let's get started today with how you began your journey in investing. So how did you discover investing, and then what ultimately led you to the precious metal space?
Well, I ended up on a trading floor after going to Wharton's Business School and ended up becoming an option trader back in 2005. And really was an interesting experience being on the trading floor when the housing bubble collapsed. And, I'd been interested in finance, obviously, it was a career, but seeing how Ben Bernanke, Hank Paulson, and everybody else on Wall Street was talking about how that was a perfect storm and that no one could have seen it coming in advance was a little bit odd, because then I started reading that, well, there were a few people who saw what was coming and actually talked about it quite a bit earlier. And I found it interesting that many of them were talking about gold and silver, which is really what led me to start learning about the Fed, these monetary cycles, what happens when you lower interest rates, what happens when you raise interest rates, and often get the opposite effect that the central bankers don't talk about quite as much. But certainly as I started getting into that more and more and seeing how it wasn't just here in the US, but really looking through any economy at any period in time, if you track what's happening with the expansion or debasement of the currency, you see some similar patterns. So that led me into studying gold and silver in particular, and left the trading floor in 2012 just to keep studying what was happening. And never imagined some of these things would take as long to play out as they have, but certainly as we're here in late 2022, interesting, somewhat heavy at times seeing the way some of these things are going. But I think we've reached the point where it's no longer, well, one day this or that might happen, or the central banks might run into a trouble with some of their policy. I think it's a fascinating period of time that's playing out right now, and the culmination of a lot of the events that have led people to think about gold and silver and brought us up to this point.
Absolutely. And we're seeing a lot of crises happen in a lot of different areas. And I want to bring up one in particular, which is the FTX meltdown. And I wanted to get your take. Do you think the negative sentiment currently surrounding crypto due to that meltdown and due to the general meltdown of the sector even before that is pushing some people from that camp to perhaps look at the precious metals for the first time?
I think that's certainly something that we could see going forward. I don't know that people, I think it's still a little bit early. I don't know if people are yet doing that. A lot of the details still unraveling. Certainly we're seeing some of the other exchanges now run into trouble with similar issues. So I think as time goes by, though, people might start to reconsider some of the projects in crypto. Obviously, you have Bitcoin and then all of the other altcoins, which have a widely varying array of risk along that spectrum. But just the idea that for some people who got into that for similar reasons with gold and silver, and looked to Bitcoin as something that couldn't be expanded. Again, there's a difference between Bitcoin and what's going on with the exchanges, yet I think that we could see some of that going forward. We're realizing, okay, there's some serious risk here, as there is in any industry, and we've seen things happen in the gold and silver space, yet that degree to which, if you have physical gold and silver, that really does eliminate that counterparty risk. And I would imagine before this is all said and done, since certainly there is some overlap in that crowd, I don't know if it's going to be everyone who owns Bitcoin or believes in it just saying, I want out of this now, but I think there could be a degree to which we do see that happening.
I want to touch on a tweet you made recently where you said the small size of the silver market relative to so many other asset classes makes it interesting to imagine how the price will move when mainstream money tries to buy. Could you expand on that and maybe let us know what you think it will take to bring more of that mainstream, more of that institutional buying into the silver space?
Sure. And just for context, we have about a billion ounces of silver come to market each year at around $21. That's 21 billion. And when you think about that in relation to even the gold market, let alone stocks, bonds, treasuries, $20 billion, especially in today's expansionary environment where you see the massive amounts of the dollar value of assets that the Fed has been buying and moving money into, it doesn't take a lot of money to move that market. In fact, a lot of the silver, about 60-70%, is consumed by industry or jewelry or silverware. And there's only about, last year I think there was about 250 million ounces went to investment demand. And right now we're actually seeing a drawdown on the exchanges. So it's not as if there's a whole lot left floating over. So if we really get into an environment where the price starts to move or there's further degradation of the currencies, which, as you pointed out, we're seeing things get shaky, it's not as if there's a lot of silver out there just sitting there that people can buy. And if you start getting institutions trying to come in, if you start getting large funds trying to come in, you have the potential to move the market very quickly. Whereas if a big fund wants to get a big portion of treasuries, that's not generally going to make a dent in that. So that's something that I think a lot of us have looked towards. Certainly a year ago at the silver squeeze back in February 2021, we saw the price move a little bit there, and that was with retail buying primarily, not trillions of dollars coming in, and we saw the effect, at least for a short period of time. Now, in terms of what it would take, I imagine that would be perhaps some sort of dislocation, of which we're heading into an era where these things are becoming increasingly likely. We've seen trouble with the English bond market a couple months ago, and they had to step back in, and so far things have calmed down there. Japanese yen has been running into trouble where they're keep intervening to prop up the currency. Not surprising that a lot of these things are happening when the Fed is raising interest rates and withdrawing liquidity, that you're getting some of these issues, just in the same way that once they did that same direction of policy back in 2006, 2007, is when you ran into the housing bubble. So what happens if Credit Suisse goes down, or if one of these banks falls apart and there's contagion? I mean, you have some similar dynamics to what's happening in crypto. And if we see something like that in the banking sector, or if we see more metal taken off these exchanges, I try to be careful to not phrase it as we're having a run on the COMEX just yet, but we've gone from 150 million ounces in registered back in February of 2021 to down to 35 million ounces, and it's been declining pretty steadily. So something like that, or perhaps the other thing that would be interesting to see is if the price finally breaks 30, which we've seen the silver price get right underneath that, go over $30 for a couple of hours last year. And that was when you saw bullion dealers on CNBC. You saw the whole world talking about silver for a couple of days. And whether I agree with it or not, we've seen that a lot of the way investing goes these days is when there's momentum, or when the price starts moving, that's when people pile in. I would say for the most part, I think the majority of the silver purchasing and the silver ownership is confined still to a rather small subset of people out there. I don't think that mainstream people are heading into silver yet, but crossing 30 could be another one of those breakpoints that could lead that to happen.
This is the Uranium Element Cube from Engineered Labs. They're a sponsor of the program now, and the reason why is because I genuinely love this product. I've always wanted to get real uranium in my hands, and that's what this is. That crystal in there is 50% uranium by weight. The acrylic shield surrounding it reduces the radiation emitted to a very low level that is completely safe. Engineered Labs also ships worldwide, which is great. The products are made in the USA, and if you use my discount code commodities at checkout, you'll receive a 10% discount on your order, and you will be supporting this program. The uranium element cube link is in the description below. And now, back to the program. You've also mentioned that you see a silver deficit up ahead. You've just spoken about some of the factors that are leading to that. Could you maybe break down that thesis for us, where you're seeing shortages? And I wanted to know if the construction of solar panels plays into that at all, because a lot of people are talking about that. Chen Lin, Gwen Preston, Peter Kraut are mentioning that photovoltaic solar panels are actually pushing silver demand quite a bit more. Does that factor into your thesis as well? And what are some of the other factors you're seeing that you think will lead us to a shortage here up ahead?
Yeah, well, first to start with, there was a report recently by the Silver Institute stating that we're headed for the largest silver deficit in decades of 194 million ounces. And that's in a 1 billion ounce market, so that's 20%. A lot of that has been the increasing solar panels. In fact, there's a fellow named Matt Watson who does a great presentation digging into that. He mentioned that right now, or actually in 2020, we used 115 gigawatts of energy, which required 100 million ounces of silver, so a tenth of the supply. And the Joe Biden administration and the International Renewable Energy Agency calls for 2,000 to 3,000 gigawatts per year of energy by 2050. So that's about a 20 to 30x, which, if you do that versus the 100 million ounces of silver that were used, you're well past what's currently being produced. So again, you have the green movement going into cars is requiring a lot more silver. All the other things that we do electronically require silver. So we're already in a deficit. You're seeing increased buying of physical silver for investment, and that's with interest rates going up. What happens when, and we can debate whether the Fed is going to pause or pivot. I think the idea that the Fed is going to have interest rates at 7 or 9% 2 or 3 years from now, it seems pretty unlikely. I know some people were thinking, and myself included, were they going to make it through this year without reversing course? All right, that's gone on longer than expected, yet it's not as if we're headed towards some stable rate environment, and whether the Fed pauses next year or whether they start cutting rates in 2 years or 3 years, you wonder what happens with the investment demand. So that combined with the industrial, you're already at a gap, and everything the Inflation Reduction Act talks about more green investment. So everything they're pushing to do to meet these carbon mandates requires more silver, at the same time that you're having people buy silver more as an investment than we've seen. A lot in channels like yours, there's the Wall Street Silver Group, where now I think there's more attention on silver than there ever has been before, at the same time where we're seeing people more concerned about what's going on macroeconomically. So when you project all of that going forward, if we're already at a deficit now and you have those factors coming into play, plus silver sitting close to the cost of production for at least a lot of the primary silver miners, permitting issues for some of the copper, lead, and zinc miners, where it's not getting easier to do these things. That's why I think you have two buckets that you look at in silver in terms of how this plays out. If you have a bigger spark in the monetary demand, that could be an issue for the supply. Or even without that, on the current trajectory, just the fundamental supply and demand picture is pretty imbalanced. And I know you have a bunch of silver miners on your show as well that talk about, if we want to have more silver right now at the current price, it's not encouraging people to go out, risk their capital to start new projects. So I think there's two ways, and possibly both of them, that are going to drive that silver price higher at some point.
You recently held an online event, Silverfest 3. Awesome event. You kicked it off with the great David Morgan, had a bunch of great guests, a great lineup, great attendance as well. I just wanted to know, what would you say was your biggest takeaway from hearing all those speakers at the conference?
Well, I think the thing that stands out to me the most is that we had a variety of different people, and I suppose somewhat it's a sub-selected group where they're all already interested in silver, but coming from a variety of different perspectives, some on the mining side, some on the macro side, some on the dealer side, some who study the trading side and are looking at the inventories, and just that while we don't know the specific timing, that it seemed hard for people to see how this current environment could be existing 5 years from now, whether there's some sort of change in the rules on the exchange, a force majeure, or whether it's the Fed running into problems. The idea that silver is sitting here at $20 in 2027 or 2030, with the way all these factors line up, just uniformly seemed almost impossible to believe to almost every speaker who came on there, which I suppose there's some degree to which a lot of us didn't expect, if you go back 10 years ago, that we'd still be sitting here now. But that, I think the biggest takeaway is that it seems like the clock is ticking on this current pricing environment.
So I wanted to ask about your own investment strategy in the silver space. I know you stack physical. I believe you invest in the miners as well. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So I had John Fennick on the show last week, and he was pointing out just how undervalued a lot of these silver miners are. So how do you approach the space? Are you invested mostly in producers? Do you do a mix of producers, developers, and explorers? How do you approach things?
Well, I have a mix of different types of mining stocks. Obviously, there's going to be a difference in preference for everyone. So perhaps the first thing I would point out is that you're taking a higher level of risk the second you go from just bullion to a mining project, because there's a lot of different things that can happen. Obviously, if you get into the explorer side, if the price of silver goes to 50 or $100, but they don't find anything, then, well, I mean, although I suppose there is, in a blow-off mania, you could have anyone with silver in the name going up, but to the bigger point, if they don't find silver, then that's a risk. Obviously, in a developer or a producer, there are things that can go wrong. Mines get shut down, governments get involved. So there is a lot of risk, and I want to be clear in pointing that out. On the other hand, you do get leverage, and we've all heard stories of during the spike in 1980, or people can look back at 2011, that when you do have these big moves in price, if you have mining stocks that are positioned well, whether they're explorers, developers, or producers, you can get a much higher rate of return on those stocks. So that's one of the reasons why I invest in those, and I think we'll have that environment. But it's a mix of those two, because silver is already pretty volatile in itself. Then you get into the mining stocks. Obviously, this year, when the price of silver came down, everything in the mining stock world got hit really hard, perhaps harder than would have seemed appropriate relative to how much bullion went down. I mean, it was basically any type of silver company, those stock prices were down a lot. So that's the downside, and I think something that people should at least consider and be prepared for before investing in the miners. But if you do have a situation where gold crosses 2,000 or goes higher, or if there is some sort of reset, and we're looking at, I was talking with a miner the other day where, what happens if we actually have a $50 silver price, not for a couple of days or a few months, but if this supply gap actually drives it there going forward, a lot of these companies will be making a lot of money, and certainly that's the best case scenario, and something that I've aimed for over this past decade. Again, when that happens, we'll see. So there is risk in doing that, but if that all lines up, then there are some exciting possibilities with the silver stocks.
I want to shift a little bit to talk about personal freedom, individual sovereignty. Now, people might be asking why, but I think that silver stackers, we kind of have that in us, that desire for freedom, that desire to be outside of government control. I think that comes from a belief in sound money and a disbelief in the fiat money system. So I was wondering how you approach that. For myself, I removed myself from Canada when all the craziness started happening, and relocated to Croatia, where I'm just enjoying so much more freedom, lower cost of living. I know you're located in Mexico, which has far less overreach in terms of the government forcing you to do things. How do you feel about, how important to you is personal freedom, and how do you think silver ties into that?
Well, like you mentioned, it is closely related. Where I think what brings a lot of people into silver is studying the government, studying the Federal Reserve, and seeing how you have more control and more inflation at the same time, which obviously is not a very pleasant combination. I left for Mexico mid last year, so I've been here about a year and a half, and it's certainly nice where you feel less oppressiveness than what I felt sometimes in the U.S. and certainly that I think a lot of us Americans have been surprised to see the way the Canadian government has turned out. We always thought they were our friendly, happy neighbors up north, and so those are things that I think people are really concerned about now. I wonder if we've actually seen what things will look like because we have central bank digital currencies being tested right now. You have obviously the policies with the pandemic over the past year that I think were pretty shocking to people, and it almost to me changed the rules of what you really thought was possible over these last couple of years, and that was a big part of me leaving, of not wanting to be forced to do something about what I put into my body or not. So along with that, silver and gold to tie that back in, a means of taking something out of the system and having protection against that financially. And I think there's a lot of people that come down to Mexico for those same reasons and go different places. You mentioned our friend Ladislas, who helps people relocate around the globe. And I mean, it's all going to be a personal preference thing. I mean, some people are more concerned about these things than others. And I know you're having a blast over there in Croatia and think you may have found the perfect spot. And I think there's pros and cons to everywhere. Some people are concerned because here in Mexico, you see people driving around in camouflage and they have machine guns, and that makes some people feel uncomfortable. So I think there's differences, whether there's a perfect spot, except for the one that you found. That's going to vary person to person, yet it's been nice to be here and at least see a different way of life and how things go. There's parts of me that sometimes misses the U.S., and I hope things don't continue to escalate there because I'd like to be able to go back there at some point. But so far, it's been nice being down here in Mexico and not as much oppression at times as what we've seen in some other places.
Yeah, and shout out to Ladislas Maurice, the wandering investor. We were talking to him talking about him before we went live, and his channel's very underrated. And he put it interestingly when I asked him the same question. He said, "Look, personal freedom is not necessarily for everyone. Some people are happy living under certain government rules and regulations, and that's fine for them. Others aren't, and there's always a give and take, right? There's no perfect solution. There are only trade-offs, as Thomas Sowell has said. So, if you want to go to a place with individual freedoms, you might have some downsides in other areas. I spoke at the top of the show how before we went on camera, I spoke about how I thought Croatia for me was the perfect place. But, it's less convenient than in the West. You everything shuts down early on Sundays. Stores close randomly. It's tougher to find certain things that you could find back home. But just for me, I mean, I was willing to go anywhere where there was personal freedom. So very happy to find here. You did touch on central bank digital currencies, and I wanted to shift to that next because according to an article on Decrypt, and you mentioned it as well, mainstream financial institutions in the US are working with the Federal Reserve to test a digital currency platform. So how much of a threat do you think CBDCs are, and do you think that the government could actually be successful in rolling out and implementing it?
Well, I guess I'll preface this with saying that there's a lot we're going to find out, and to some degree it's a guess right now. Although I've heard that a friend of mine who was recently in England, he mentioned how they're pretty well advanced. He tried to go to the supermarket and they were asking for his digital ID. So is this something that everyone is forced to opt into? Does it get to the point where just to buy food you have to have the microchip? I sure hope not. It seems like they're moving forward. Again, it was a 12-week test program that the Fed is conducting right now. To what degree are we going to be forced to use that? Can you stay outside of that? Does the supermarket require you to use that? I hope not. Um, the idea that you have that social credit score where if you're buying too much of one product, then they shut it down, or that your money just expires if you don't spend it within a certain period of time. There's certainly some scary precedents. My guess is that in the end, it comes down to how much people fight back or resist against that. If everyone just lines up and says, "Hey, this sounds great, give me mine," then probably will be easier to push that through. Yet, if people are resistant to that, I think there's some boundaries to what these governments are able to do, and in ways that it might not always seem like that. That when people band together and stand up, it doesn't necessarily need a majority of everyone on the same page, but just with a little resistance, sometimes can foil some of these schemes. So I hope that's the way that it goes. And again, we'll see over time, but certainly concerning some of the things that you see associated with these projects.
Now we all want those of us in the precious metals community all want to return to sound money in one form or another. And I want to ask you that question. I also asked it to Rafi Farber, your friend, who you've also had on your show. What is your idea of a return to sound money? Would it actually be bartering using silver coins and small denominations of gold? Would it be a silver and or gold-backed currency, a gold-backed token on the blockchain, or how do you see a return to sound money?
Well, perhaps a simple ideal would be something like what the dollar used to represent, where the dollar came along so that we don't have to shave off our gold nuggets, and you have something that's more divisible using the silver and the coins, that there was something actually backing it, which made it harder to just print money at will for whatever policy that the current folks in power advocate. And given that we were doing that really before you had all of the computer technology that we have today, seems like something that would be feasible. And just the idea of preventing that inflation that has made everything so expensive over these past decades in particular. I was reading something recently where they were mentioning how back in the 60s and 70s, you could have one person out working. You didn't need to have two or three jobs. A house was affordable, so you could go do your craft, buy a house, have a place to live, have time to enjoy being with your family. And now it's getting really difficult for a lot of people out there, which I think is quite unfortunate. So that to me, the main the main ideal that I would hope for is that going forward we have something where it's not constantly prices getting jacked up. And I mean, we see these rates of inflation in different countries and food prices just getting out of control for a lot of people. I think is quite unfortunate. Now, in terms of how it may play out, especially if some of these central bank digital currencies are a bigger portion of what we have going forward, that could force us into bartering stuff with silver. And I hope that that's not what it has to come to, but there is that possibility out there. And fortunately, I guess the one advantage that we do have with the blockchain is that you do have the technology to have something that's actually backed. There's projects like Kinesis and others that are already using something like that, where there's a finite amount of stored gold and silver relative to the currency that's being used. So I think there's the technology available. There's certainly people like you and I, and perhaps a lot of the folks watching this, that are in favor of that. And hopefully that's something that we will head more towards. Obviously, the governments will probably be pushing in the other direction, as is often the case. But certainly it would be nice to get more towards something that's more equitable, that rather than the government or the banks being able to just pull large chunks of wealth out, and in the end you have the prices of everything going up so darn much.
So before I let you go, I just wanted to get your thoughts on any other commodities outside of the gold and silver space that you're seeing opportunity in right now, or are you just focused on the precious metals?
Well, I spend far too much of my time digging into silver. I know there's a good case to be made for uranium given some of the energy needs. And obviously, there's a lot of other good opportunities out there, although really these days I focus mostly on silver and things that are going on in there. Probably too much time, and I know there are other things going on in the world, but certainly on the silver side, I think for the conditions that we have in the world and a long-term horizon, there's a good case to be made that it's worth owning.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Chris. For those who want to hear more from you, could you let viewers know about Arcadia Economics and anywhere else they can find you online?
You can find us at arcadiaeconomics.com. We have a YouTube channel where we do a daily show digging into the latest developments in silver, bringing on guests, and just trying to keep people updated on what's going on, the different things that are happening out there, and why people are turning to silver, why the price is going up or down at a given point in time, and just trying to provide some solutions to some of the things that we see going on in the world right now.
Great. Well, I'll put links to those in the description below. And thank you so much for joining us. Would love to have you on again in the future to continue the conversation.
Well, thank you, Jesse. I appreciate it, and thanks for having me on your show.
Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.